Okay, let's get started on this week's activity, CSS Positioning. So step 1 is to verify that you have the correct files. So you should have a positioning.html and a positionstyles.css. So I'm going to check my code here, and I can see I have my positioning.html file right here and the positioningstyles.css file. So if you don't have all the files that you need, you're going to want to get the starter code again, or if you scroll to the bottom of the activity, the code is right here, and so you can copy and paste it and create your own files by clicking New File and then creating the file you need and then copying and pasting that code in. But I have the correct files, so I don't need to do that. Okay, so that was step 1. Let's move on to step 2. Step 2 is to solve the challenges. So we're going to modify the CSS to make the boxes in the HTML match the patterns in the images for each activity. So what does that mean? Okay, so let's go here. Here I'm on my code, and I'm going to view it in a new window. And I need to go to positioning.html. So now I have the code, and it said I need to make it look like the image. So if I click the image, I can see, okay, this is what I need to make these boxes look like. So let's go back to the instructions. Now step 3 is for exercise number 1. So we're going to do exercise 1 together. After this, you're going to do the rest of them on your own, okay? And I know you can do it. So we're looking at the image. We have the image pulled up over here. And okay, so this image has a little more information than the other images have, and I'll show you that in a second, because it has the grid lines that you need and shows the rows and the columns. And then we'll also take a look at the HTML in a second. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So we can see here where the grid lines are. So we have the grid lines here, here, here. You can see those pink grid lines. And then the boxes within. So we can see that this red box spans the 2 rows here and goes through the gap, and then the blue one as well, whereas these boxes sit in the middle of those columns. Okay. Oh, and then the HTML. We're going to look at the HTML. So looking at the HTML, I can see that here is where our first activity is. We have a div with the class content1, and then each of the squares has a class. So we have red one, green one, another green one, yellow one, and blue one. So these are the boxes that we have for this first activity. And when I open up the hint, it says to check out the activity instructions, because again, we're going through this. For your other activities, you will have different hints. Okay, so we talked about the HTML. So now the first step with using CSS Grid is to identify which elements we are trying to move. Okay, so in this case, it's probably those boxes, right? Because we need those boxes to look like the image. So the elements that we're trying to move are going to be the grid, items, or children. And then we need to find the parent, which would be the grid container. And so we need to turn on CSS Grid for the container or the parent. And once we do that, all of the children will become grid items. So it's helpful to know which one the parent is. So we looked at the code, and the parent is, we'll look at it again. The parent is this div with the class of content1. And then its child elements are all of these divs with the color classes. So if we turn grid on for the parent, then all of these elements are going to become grid children. If this doesn't sound familiar, then you might need to reread the readings for this week. It's really important that you do those before this activity, or you're going to have a really hard time. Okay, So, and then yes, it talks about just what I pointed out. So those colored boxes are our child elements, and then the common parent is the content one. Okay, so now we need to adjust the box sizes. So before we start our grid, let's take a moment to make sure the box is all the right size and shape. The image above, which I'll go to the image in a second, shows that red and blue should be full width. We talked about that. An easy way to make something full width is to set its width to 100%. So we're going to change the pixels in the existing rule to a percentage. And then it says that green and yellow look to be about twice their current size. So we're going to change the height and width to 200 pixels. So let's take a look at that image real fast. And we can see, yes, the red and the blue span 100% each. And then the, sorry, I have the instructions up on this side too, and I'm looking at them. And then these boxes are about twice the size that they are right now. So we will make them that size, the 200 pixels. So let's go into the CSS and do that. So I'm going to the positionstyles.css. This is the CSS page for the positioning.html file. How can I tell? At the top of the HTML file, we have a link to the positionstyles.css file. So now going into that file, here is content 1. So we need to turn grid on. Okay, so display grid. Okay, and now which ones do we have to make 100%? The red and the blue. So right now we have the width at 100 pixels. So instead of 100 pixels, we're going to make it 100%. And then the blue, we're going to make it also 100%. Okay, and then the green and the yellow, we are going to make them 200 by 200 instead of 100 by 100. So we're going to expect the yellow squares to get larger, and same with the green squares, and then the red ones should span 100% and the blue one should span the full width, 100%. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to have to go back to positioning.html. I am actually going to just open this in a new tab so that it doesn't refresh on me all the time. Okay, so now you can see, okay, so my red box is taking 100%, the blue box is taking 100%, and then my yellow and my green here, they look taller. I don't know if they look wider, but it could just be because my screen is so wide. I have a very wide screen right now. So let's go take a look at the instructions real fast again. So we just did step 4. We're moving on to step 5. Oh, turn on CSS grid. We just did that. Check that out. Okay, so for the rest of the activity, it will be helpful if you open this link. I can confirm that this is true. So, one thing to know is that, you know, as you've gone through some of the readings, it might be really overwhelming, all of the terms and the ways that you can style things, but this is a really good article to reference while you are working on things like CSS Grid. And CSS Tricks is a really great website, really great resource. And I actually reference this article frequently within my regular job because I don't even remember all of the terms and all of the terms in here. It's just hard to remember, and so I reference this article frequently at my job today. So I don't expect you to remember everything, but it is important that you understand the underlying concepts. Okay. So this article will be really helpful for you, and you'll want to have it open to reference as you are going through the rest of the activity. Okay, so moving on. We're going to switch the CSS file now. Okay, we were there. And find the section of the code for the first exercise. Okay, we did that. So real fast, I do want to point out, so I have already done this stuff, so I might have already done a little bit. That's in step 5, and that's okay. But this is where we have content 1, red 1, green 1, yellow 1, blue 1. So these are all the items for the first activity. Now for the other activities, you're going to need to style other items. So right here, you can see this comment on line 29 where it says activity 2 styles. Okay, and so now we can see content 2, red 2, green 2, yellow 2, and blue 2. And then we scroll further, there's activity 3, activity 4, activity 5, activity 6. And so you're going to want to make sure that you are working within the correct activity as you go through. And then here there's a comment, do not make any changes below here, because the you see how they have these in boxes, and the hints are styled. So if you mess with that CSS, you're going to mess with that. So don't do that. Okay. So it says enable CSS grid for the element by adding the line display grid to that rule. We did that. So you'll notice nothing changed. Okay, we didn't look at our code right away, but it wouldn't have changed, and I recommend that you look at it right after you do this. So we have to define at least the columns of the grid before anything happens. Okay, so let's do that. Now, if you review the example image, again, we'll look at it in a second, you will see that you need 2 equal columns for our grid. This is easy to do with the FR unit and the grid template columns property. If we add that, our rule should look like the following. Okay, so we're going to add grid template columns and then 1 FR, 1 FR. So let's check out the image again real fast. And yes, I can see there are 2 equal size columns. They're not different size, they're the same size. So now I'm going to go back to my CSS and I will scroll back up to activity 1. So I have display grid, I have grid turned on. And now I need to turn on grid template columns. And then we're making 2 columns. We want them to be the same width. So we are going to use the FR property. 1 FR, 1 FR. And then our colon. And let's refresh this. So now it looks kind of funny, but it does look like there's 2 columns, right? Okay. Okay, it talks about glitch possibly marking the grid template columns as an error. I think that's a little outdated. It's not an error anymore. Grid has been in use for a while, but it hasn't been widely used until very recently, and so that's probably why glitch used to say that it was an error. It no longer says that it's an error, at least for me. If it does for you, just know that it's not an error. If there is an error, double check that you spelled it right. Okay, so as soon as you define the columns, you should see the change. Yep, we saw that change. Okay, so finishing up. So we want to get our layout to match the image. We only have 3 steps left. So first we need to tell the red and the blue that they should take up 2 columns instead of 1, which is the default. And then we need to adjust the horizontal alignment of the yellow and the green boxes. And then we need to add some space between the columns and the rows, because if we review this image again, we can see that there's a gutter here. Okay, so how are we going to do that? We're going to use the grid column property to specify how many columns an element should span. So remember, when we use the property, we specify the column by describing the grid lines it falls between. If you look at the example image, you will notice that there are numbers along the top edge. If we want something in column 1, we would place it between line 1 and 2. If we want something to take up all 3 columns, or all the, sorry, I'm not reading anymore, then we would place it between lines 1 and 3. So let's look at this CSS, and real fast I want to show you that on the image as well. So we can see here there's the line. So this is line 1, this is line 2, this is line 3. So just like it said, this green one is between line 1 and 2, and this green one is between lines 2 and 3. Okay. So it's saying the red one, we want to say grid column 1/3. And what that's doing is we're saying we want you to take up the space between lines 1 and 3. So if we look at the image, we can see that for the red one, we want it to go all the way from here to here. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so here's our red. Oh, and look, there's even a spot. Grid column 1, 3. Okay, let's see how this is looking. Oh, look at that. So now it knows that it needs to take up those 2 columns. So I can still see I have a column on this side, and I have a column over here, and now my red is taking up that full column. It's awesome. And I want to show you real fast also in this CSS grid article by CSS Tricks. If I remembered, I was like, okay, I can't remember, how do I get them to span all the way across, or how do I like choose how many columns? I can look this article, and over on the left side it says properties for the parent, the container, and over here it says properties for the children, the grid items. And so the red box is child, I know that, it's one of my grid items, and so I can look over at the things over here. Okay, so we talk about there's grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, grid row end, and I can just kind of scroll down, scan, and see if I can find what I needed. Oh, here's an example. So this item is spanning these columns. How did they do that? And I can see their CSS up here. So as you're going through the activity, if you can't remember how to do something, you can look through this, and I can see, okay, so grid column 3 span 2. Okay, so it's spanning 2, right? So this is how you can reference this as you need to. Okay, so now we need to do the same in the blue box. So on the red, we had grid column 1/3, so that we could tell it that we want it to span between line 1 and line 3. So now we're putting that on blue, and if we take a look at our code now, we can see that it spans that whole way, just like the red one. So we're getting pretty close. Now we just need to have these centered within the column, and then put a gutter so that they're not touching, right? Because if we look back at our image, the boxes are not touching this way, and the boxes are also centered within their columns. Okay, so horizontal alignment is controlled with the justify properties. In this case, the specific one we want is justify items. We can add this to our grid container to center the yellow and green boxes. Okay, so we're adding it to the container, which is the parent. So justify items center. Let's go to our CSS, and here's my content 1. And I'm going to justify content center. And now let's refresh this. Or I apologize. So it wasn't justify content, it was justify items. Justify content is another property that you can use though. I typically use it with Flexbox. I honestly use Flexbox more than I use Grid. Okay, so justify item center. Now let's refresh that. And now we can see they're in the center. So we're super close. We just need to get the gutter on there so that these items are not touching anymore. Okay, so like it says, we need to have some space called a gap. I keep calling it a gutter. It's officially called a gap. You can call it whatever you'd like. Okay, so we need to put that gutter between our rows and our columns, so we can use the grid gap property to add this. So in the instructions it says 20 pixels are good, and so we're going to do that. We're going to add a grid gap of 20 pixels to the parent activity or parent item. Oop, and if I can spell. Okay, and now let's refresh. Awesome. So now we have that gutter too. So we have our red spanning all the way and the blue, and then these items centered within their columns, and then they have the gutter between them, the big gap. So it's looking good, and we're done. So step 7 is to do exercises 2 through 6. So here's a few tips. Don't overuse position. It might seem to be the answer to your positioning prayers, but it can quickly become a nightmare if overused. Try to solve layout problems with other methods first, and fall back to position only if they don't work. Okay? Remember that margin is a great way to shift things around short distances, and margin top, negative 50 pixels, would move an element up by 50 pixels. So I'm going to give you an extra hint here. Let's see, is it this one? I think it's this one. So activity 2, that is a very good thing to keep in mind. And it actually gives you a hint talking about margin, and then we have more details about margin here. Okay, that's a hint. That's a hint if you're stuck. Okay, number 3, when using float, remember that the element that you are floating must come before the other elements in the HTML. Also remember to clear your floats when you want things to stop floating. What does clearing your floats mean? There is a description about that in, I believe it's the first article you should have read during your readings. So if that's confusing, go back and check that out. And I will say you will be floating elements for this activity. There's one activity that will only work using a float. That's another hint for you. Okay, tip number 4, CSS Grid is a great way to position elements. Most of these can be easily solved by using it. Remember that to use CSS Grid, first find the elements you want to adjust, then find their parent. Use display grid on that parent. And then here are a couple of good resources to help you with CSS Grid. So we opened the CSS tricks. I want to show you guys Grid Garden. You guys should absolutely go through this and go through all 28 levels. It will take time. So if you're strapped for time, you can try to get away without it. But if you do this activity, you will have a much easier time with the positioning challenges. So if you're struggling to go through those challenges, do the Grid Garden, and you will have it. It will just be easier for you. If you get through all 28 levels, you will get it. Or you won't get it, but you'll have an easier time, especially if you do them right after each other. Promise. Okay. Tip number 5, you should be able to solve all of these positioning problems without modifying the HTML. So if you find yourself tempted to tweak the HTML, you are probably working too hard. You cannot modify the HTML for this activity. If you do, I will take points off. You can solve the problems however you want, but you have to use CSS only. Okay, if you move the HTML, again, I will take points off. If you are struggling with an activity, start by simply making the boxes the right size and shape. It will often help you to see what or where to go next. And number 7, and did I mention that you should not modify the HTML? I was pretty serious about that. So again, I will take points off. Okay, and then step 8 is to publish. So show your page in Glitch and open your positioning HTML website in your browser to make sure the web page displays correctly. Pay special attention to whether your styles are all displaying. Once you've verified it, submit the URL to your page in iLearn. So you'll click Submit Assignment and submit the URL to me. And if hopefully by now you know how to find the URL, but you can go to Share. You can share your project page with me, that's fine, but just sharing the live app is perfect as well. Okay, and so basically I'm going to grade that you completed the assignment as outlined. So what I'm looking for is that your activity matches the images. It doesn't matter to me how you did it, as long as you did not edit the HTML, okay? And that they match the images. So this is what activity 2 should look like. Activity 3 will look similar to this. Again, my screen's really white, so it might look a little different, but generally. Activity 4, activity 5. Let's just check out the hint here. Ooh, this one is the one you're going to use float. Remember I said one of the activities can only be done using float? That was a really big hint, guys. Okay, activity 6 will look like this. And again, like this activity, or if this is really tough for you, do the grid garden, okay? It will help you a lot. And then below here is just the code if you don't have the code, just like we talked about. So that's the activity for this week. I hope that was helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing how you guys solve these problems. They can be done multiple ways, so it'll be fun to see how each of you does that. I will have more appointment slots in the calendar this week to support you guys through this difficult activity, but remember the tutoring center is also available, and they're a really great resource, so don't forget about that.